Alright, what's going on everybody? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we're going to go ahead and wrap up with our final video for our Theros Beyond Death archetype breakdown. We've already done 5 videos, each showcasing 2 of the color pairs within the format, within the limited format. Talking about their strengths, their weaknesses, the best cards that you can get for them as far as rares go, the payoff, so on and so forth. This time I wanted to talk about an extra little thing that Theros is providing in the Devotion decks. And I want to be very clear that I don't think Devotion decks means that you're going to be able to draft a monocolored deck too often, or at least not a good monocolored deck. Eldraine really supported that with artifacts and hybrid colored cards and a couple other payoffs for being there, like the triple colored rares and stuff like that. Theros doesn't really do that. There's not a lot of artifacts to kind of pave the way for a monocolored deck. Outside of Devotion cards, there's actually not even really a lot of incentive to go into a monocolored deck. So I want to kind of caution from the very beginning that I don't think monocolored decks are a thing, but there will be Devotion decks that care about certain key Devotion cards and want to adjust their strategy accordingly. The game plan for a Devotion deck is to try and stick to one color as much as possible, even though oftentimes you will end up in a 2-color deck, maybe even more than that. You're really not a Devotion deck if you end up splashing a 3rd color, though. It's just not really a thing that comes together. It's worth noting that when I say you want to stick to a color as much as possible, I'm thinking that you're going to end up with something like a 10-7 mana base. You might have 2/3 of your card pool be, let's say, black, and then your secondary color is not your Devotion color, right? A lot of the Devotion cards are just decent standalone cards, so you don't even necessarily need to push them, but they do get better if you support them, especially with the demigods and the gods, which we will talk about. And if you find yourself moving into a Devotion game plan, if you find that you just have a bunch of gray merchants or something like that, you want to maximize on that by prioritizing permanents over actual spells that don't stick on board. So enchantment-based removal instead of sorcery instant speed removal might be more relevant for a deck that cares about Devotion cards, just because you want to maximize on how many of those mana symbols you can get on board. So the way we're going to do this is we're just going to go through each color and talk about every Devotion card that is in that color and whether or not it's really worth pushing in that direction or not. We will start off each color by talking about the god. If I've already talked about the god in a previous video, I might kind of glance over it a little bit. And I'm not going to sit here and, talk about every single god and all the nuances of that god, just how likely it is you are to get it online, how good it is if you do get it online, so on and so forth, right? As far as the gods go, they are very interchangeable as far as creatures go. I couldn't even tell you the stat line on most of them. I think Perforos is a 7/6, whatever. They're all kind of just huge, indestructible threats. But if we go back to original Theros, the gods actually were a little bit underwhelming as big splashy mythic rares because Devotion to 5 is a lot more than it sounds like, right? It's easy to kind of goldfish a deck and say, oh, I can have my Devotion to white be 5 on turn 4 or something like that, but your opponent disrupts that a lot, and a lot of times they can take your god offline by just killing your other creatures. So when you are drafting one of the gods, kind of analyze it for its passive and activated ability before you analyze it as a creature, and consider the creature part of it upside. And sometimes it ends up being downside, right? If your opponent has exile target creature in their hand, which there is a common that does that in the set, turning your god into a creature is actively bad instead of the upside you would think it would be. So think about these as just enchantments that sometimes happen to be giant indestructible creatures. But the game plan should be to take advantage of their activated and passive abilities before taking advantage of them as a creature. All right, so we got that out of the way. Let's talk about Heliod. 2 and a white, 5/5, indestructible. Your Devotion to white has to be 5 or greater. Otherwise, Heliod is not a creature. And the passive here says whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or enchantment you control. It's a little bit weird to put +1 counters on enchantments, especially since most of the enchantment creatures are already creatures. But the reason it says that, in case you're wondering, is so that Heliod can put a counter on himself if he is not currently a creature. And then when he becomes a creature, he retains those +1/+1 counters. So that's why it's worded that way. In addition to that, you can pay 1 and a white to give another target creature a lifelink until end of turn, and I think that's really what sells me on this card. is just being able to pay 2 mana to throw around lifelink would not necessarily be worth a card. It does kind of require that you have good creatures, but the fact that whenever those creatures hit, even if they trade off, you get to start throwing around +1/+1 counters on other creatures, and then you can lifelink those. This is kind of a self-contained engine. And if you can get even one little evasive creature on board, things get really out of hand, right? You get to lifelink and swing a race, and then that creature grows over time as well, gaining you more life, putting the race farther out of favor, so on and so forth. I do think Heliod is very strong as far as the gods go, and even if it never becomes a creature, it is a justifiable card to have in your deck. Each color has a demigod. I believe at one point or another, we've probably talked about all of these. Up to this point, maybe I'm wrong, but Daxos is your white god, and probably the worst of all the gods, if you think about it. This is white for a 2x legendary enchantment creature. The toughness is equal to your devotion to white. So on its own, it's going to be a 2/2 for 2. Granted, that's double white, so you can't reliably have this out on turn 2 every single time if you're in a 2-color deck, but it doesn't necessarily have to be on turn 2. The effect here says whenever a creature you control enters the battlefield or dies, you gain a life. And clearly, these are designed to kind of go with the god a little bit. Daxos works very well with Heliod, and that life gain does add up. You're used to these sorts of effects just being one or the other whenever a creature enters the battlefield or dies, but it triggers on both your creature's die and end coming into play, so this can actually gain enough life that it's an annoyance to your opponent, and it can be a really high toughness blocker. I just don't think it's ever really that good of an attacker, and pumping toughness past like 4 or 5 ends up not really mattering too much. So going all in on devotion to make Daxos' toughness a lot bigger doesn't really seem worth it, right? I'm not first picking a Daxos and then trying to go into mono white and draft mono white devotion so that my Daxos will have more toughness. That just really doesn't make any sense to me. A fine card to include in a white deck, especially if you care a lot about enchantments, but not really something that's pushing the envelope when it comes to devotion. White has Reverent Hoplite, which we talked about in our Boros video. It's 4 and a white for a 1/2 uncommon human soldier, and when it enters the battlefield, you make 1/1 white human soldier tokens equal to your devotion to white. So this actually is a huge payoff for being in mono white, and besides the god itself, this is probably the best payoff you can ask for mono white. Just being able to turn all of your white devotion into 1/1s can sometimes be a little bit underwhelming if you only have 1 or 2 blips on board. But if you have somewhere around 4 to 5, then this is a 1/2 that comes with 3 or 4 extra tokens. That's actually extremely powerful effect. And as we mentioned in the Boros video, that is kind of what Boros wants to be doing, right? So as far as Reverent Hoplite goes, if I have this in my card pool, it is the type of card that's pushing me to draft more white symbols in my cards. And as we mentioned in a lot of the white videos, white can actually get its devotion pretty high because a lot of its removal is in the form of enchantments that sit on board. So all of your Banish and Light type effects, your Dreadful Apathy, your Heliod's Punishment, so on and so forth, those are enchantments that help you kind of disrupt your opponent while also adding to your white devotion. So it should be pretty often that you can play a card like Reverent Hoplite and get it to come with at least a couple buddies. Daybreak Chimera is 3 white for a 3/3 common creature. It's a Chimera, has flying, and it costs X less to cast, where X is your devotion to white. So this goes all the way from a 5-mana 3/3 to, at its best, potentially white for a 3/3 flyer, which is very powerful. Even if you don't necessarily cast that on like turn 3 or turn 4, it does mean that you can double spell later on in the game, and one of those spells is going to be a super efficient flyer, right? So you can flood the board with power. This is actually a pretty decent card to go into, a close to mono white deck for as well. Imagine this is a common. Imagine you're one of the only white drafters at the table and you get past, 3 of these altogether. That would incentivize me to try and draft cards like Daxos and Reverent Hoplite, just because it is double white itself, so it adds to additional devotion, and it gets paid off for having white devotion, right? You can feasibly cast this on turn 3 if you have like 1-drop, 2-drop, and then you hit all your land drops, or you should probably be able to cast it almost always on turn 4 in a typical white deck. So not a game-busting card, right? A 3/3 flyer isn't always going to end the game on its own, but a 3/3 flyer for potentially 2 mana is just a hyper-efficient card, especially for a common. Moving into blue, we've talked about a lot of the blue payoffs already for Devotion, but let's go ahead and talk about Thassa again. This one is 3 in a blue for a 6/5. Again, power and toughness, whatever on the gods. They're all huge indestructible creatures if they ever become indestructible, so it's not really too big a deal what their power and toughness is. As long as your Devotion to blue is less than 5, Thassa isn't a creature, so on and so forth. We'll kind of shortcut that for the rest of the gods. At the beginning of your end step, exile up to one other target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. So this is a little bit weird, this Conjurer's Closet type effect. There aren't a ton of enter the battlefield triggers going on the creatures in this set, but there is a lot of Constellation in this set. So this actually lets you trigger Constellation over and over again on your end step by blinking an enchantment creature you control. There's also one other really neat thing you can do, since it specifically says that it exiles the creature and then returns it to the battlefield under your control. If you happen to cast a card like Portent of Betrayal that lets you steal an opponent's creature for the turn, you can use Thassa to blink that creature, and then it will stay under your control permanently because it's no longer tied to the Portent. So not a huge thing, but just something that could come up with specifically the card Portent of Betrayal. On top of that, the activated ability is 3 in a blue, tap another target creature. I mentioned Thassa in the blue-red video. That's just a good mana sink in a set that doesn't have a ton of good mana sinks. Sure, all the gods have kind of mana sinks attached to them, but they're mythic rare, so you're not reliably going to have that sort of thing to dump your mana into. And there are much worse things than using your mana to just tap creatures, right? Sure, you're not often going to get to the point where you can pay 8 mana and tap 2 creatures down, but I don't know, Thassa stalls the game, so you could feasibly get there, and stalling the game does make it more likely that you're going to be able to add to your Devotion to blue and get Thassa going as a creature. So altogether, kind of a weird card, right? That exile thing is not really something I would build my whole deck around, but it is something to keep in mind when you're drafting Constellation cards. We mentioned Calliphy in both our blue-white and, I believe, green-blue videos. This is the blue demigod, 1 blue-blue for an X3 with power equal to your Devotion to blue. I absolutely love the demigods that pump their power rather than the 2 that pump their toughness, just because this can potentially be a game ender with the right kind of board state, whereas the ones that pump the toughness never really get that much better, or rather the ceiling on them is a lot lower than the ones that pump their power. Calliphy also has the additional bonus of making your opponent pay an additional mana to target your creatures or enchantments with spells. Not a huge amount, right? This doesn't make them pay 2 or 3 more, just 1 additional mana, which is more of a minor annoyance than a huge thing, but that is that nice little layer of protection I've been talking about for these blue-based enchantment decks, and it's just a nice little bonus to have on a creature that you're already pretty happy to play. Thassa's Oracle we talked about at the very beginning of this series. This is blue-blue for a 1/3 Merfolk Wizard at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you look at the top X cards where X is your Devotion to blue. You put one of them on top of your library, the rest of them go to the bottom randomly, and then you just get this random rider that says, if X is greater than or equal to the number of cards in your library, you win the game. So if if your Devotion to blue at the time that this enters the battlefield is greater than or equal to the number of cards in your library, you just win, right? And we mentioned Thassa's Oracle was going to be at its best in the self-mill deck because you can actually use it as a game plan to win with Thassa's Oracle. Just mill yourself as low as possible and then get your Devotion to a reasonable amount for blue and then play Thassa's Oracle and bada boom, bada bang, you win the game. As far as a mono blue payoff, this doesn't actually net you cards. It just lets you look at the next card that you're going to draw, essentially, out of a selection of cards. So it's not like a hugely powerful rare if you're just using it for kind of card filtering, but it does have that extra win clause. Not something that I'm drafting and saying, okay, I'm going to be mono blue, but something that does pay you off, at least in a slight way, for having a bunch of blue mana symbols in your cards while also being a really kind of wonky backup win condition. Threnody, is this pronounced Threnody? I don't know. Threnody Singer is 1 in a blue for a 1/3 uncommon siren. It has flash and flying, so 2 mana 1/3 flash flyer, already a card that I'd be pretty happy to play. And it says when it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -X/-0 until end of turn, where X is your Devotion to blue at. So at very minimum, if you just count this card by itself, it's a 2 mana 1/3 flash flyer that gives a creature -1/-0 when it enters the battlefield for the turn. and oftentimes will be a little bit better than that, since your devotion is more than likely going to be greater than 1. This reminds me of the Fairy Duelist card from, I want to say Ravnica Allegiance, the 1-2 that flashed in and gave something -2/-0. That was just a very solid card, and it really punished creatures for attacking with, or rather punished players for attacking with smaller 1 toughness creatures. Threnody Singer doesn't exactly brawl super powerfully itself, but it can stop an attacker for the turn if not set up a favorable block in your position. So again, not the type of card that really pushes you to draft mono blue, but a decent card on its own that gets a little bit better when you have other blue permanents laying around. Moving into black, black actually has the most devotion cards in this set, and that might be a callback to Theros as well, where I believe it also had the most black devotion payoffs. Our big god here we talked about in the last video, Erebos Bleak-Hearted, is 3 and a black for a 5/6, legendary blah blah blah. It has the devotion clause, indestructible, and the effect here is that whenever another creature you control dies, you may pay 2 life to draw a card, and that's pretty huge, right? No mana investment, just turning creatures dying into extra card draw. And we mentioned in the previous video that this is going to be at its best in red-black, where you're actively sacrificing your own creatures, but in a normal game, creatures just die, right? Your opponent trades off creatures. Erebos lets you turn all of those creatures into extra cards, even though it does cost you a little bit of life, so you can't go crazy on it. It's just a nice little bonus. You can also pay 1 in a black, sacrifice another creature, which will proc the first ability. Target creature gets -2/-1 until end of turn. And we said previously that -2/-1 doesn't often kill creatures, but it makes it so that your opponent can't actively attack with certain creatures, because you can just shrink them in combat and eat them with your other creatures. So if you have creatures that are worth sacrificing, or if you're just playing a grindy game in general where you're trying to trade off creatures, maybe Death Touchers and things of that nature, Erebos is going to be an absolute nightmare for your opponent. But Erebos does require a little bit of a life investment and creature investment in order to really peak. So it's not just a standalone bomb mythic rare. It does require a little bit of work to get to that status. Not sure if we've mentioned Temerret yet or not. This is the other god that pumps toughness with its devotion, or rather demigod. It's black for a 2x, x being your devotion to black. So 2/2 on its own, whatever. 2 mana 2/2 that adds 2 black devotion. That matters a little bit, but it just gets more toughness as time goes on and as your board develops. Never really gets any more power. And out of all the demigods, this has perhaps the least exciting ability. For 1 in a black, you can exile up to 2 cards from graveyards. You gain a life for each creature exiled this way. Now, I'm not trying to poo-poo Temerret, because that is a very relevant ability in a set that has escape and has these mythic rare titans and stuff like that. Even a couple raised dead effects and reanimation spells floating around this set. So Temerret does have a relevant activated ability. It's just not a super powerful activated ability. And on top of that, Temerret never gets bigger than, say, a 2/4, 2/5 or something like that. Even if this was a 2/10, I wouldn't evaluate it really that much differently. So Temerret, fine card. If you're looking for ways to make your black deck work, or looking for your devotion to be a little bit better, Temerret's a fine card, but it's not exactly insane like some of the other demigods we've talked about. Gray Merchant of Asphodel. Gary made an appearance here, and he has been shifted to the correct rarity at uncommon instead of common this time around. If you've never played with Gary, it is a very powerful card. It's 3 black for a 2/4. It's uncommon here, and it says when it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life. You gain X life equal to the amount of life lost this way. So 2-headed giant all-star for sure. But on top of that, Gray Merchant is just a solid card, right? 5 mana, 2/4 is not a very good stat line, but when it comes with a Drain 2 attached to it on its very own, that's pretty good. And then on top of that, it's going to count all of your other black devotion. You just have a Temerret on board, you play Gray Merchant, you drain your opponent for 4, and it's not inconceivable to have a board state that has a lot more black devotion than just 2 or 4. Sometimes a Gray Merchant is your entire game plan. You just recur it, play it a couple times, and your opponent can't kill you because of the life gain and because of the 4 toughness, and you are actively killing your opponent by just playing Gray Merchants over and over again. Being an uncommon means that you're usually not going to get more than one of this, and I do expect Gray Merchants to be picked up very early in packs, as early as first picks, just because people recognize the card, and even if it's not correct to first pick it, people will be taking Gary's because people remember how good it is in things like Commander and Original Theros and Standard and so on and so forth. So it's probably going to be an overrated card, but as far as Black Devotion decks go, this is probably your best Devotion payoff. Drag to the Underworld is 2 black for an uncommon instant. It costs X less to cast, where X is your devotion to black, and the effect is just murder, destroy target creature. This can cost as little as black, in which case it's a hyper efficient removal spell, but even at 2 black, this is a pretty good card, and it's not too often that this will cost the full 4 mana anyway. You're almost likely in your black deck that supports a black removal spell going to have a Black Devotion card on board somewhere, and I think it's pretty easy to have this just be murder, and sometimes better than murder. I don't put a lot of stock in this card being 2 mana over 4 mana, because you would play it at 4 mana and be very happy. You're just you being a little bit more mana efficient when you get to cast this for 2 mana, and that doesn't really change much. Again, this is a card that's just very powerful removal spell. It's not really a reason to start drafting a bunch of Black Devotion, because even at 4 mana, this card is just fine. Blight Breath Catoblepis is 4 black for a 3/2. Okay, that's a little bit low on the vanilla scale. 6 mana, 3/2, but it's got a pretty good effect. When it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -X until end of turn, where X is your devotion to black. So you get a 6 mana, 3/2, a very understated creature as far as mana cost goes, but you get a small removal spell attached to it, and on its own it's going to give something -2/2, but by the time you're casting your 6-drop creature, it should be able to take out something bigger. It's not inconceivable that this is going to give something -4, -5, and just be a really expensive Ravenous Chupacabra. One thing to note here is that Devotion can change on an ETB effect by the time that spell resolves. So if you play a Gray Merchant of Asphodel, or you play a Blight Breath Catoblepis, and the trigger goes on the stack, your opponent has a window to remove creatures or permanents from your side of the field, which can actually reduce your Devotion to black before those abilities resolve. So keep that in mind when you're targeting with something like a Blight Breath Catoblepis, that if you suspect your opponent has removal, you might actually be shrinking for less than you would hope so with this ability. And this is not actually a Devotion card itself, but I wanted to mention Underworld Dreams because it is the only triple color card in the entire set. There are some cards that cost 2, like red, white for Haktos or whatever, but Underworld Dreams is actually the only triple color card, so it's the only way to use a single card to add 3 Devotion to your mana pool, which means, black gets the one card that can actually add tons and tons of Devotion. Underworld Dreams by itself isn't an insane card. It's black for an enchantment that says your opponent takes a life whenever they draw a card. So not like great. It basically just dings them once per turn, and that's not really worth a full card. But if you're curving this into your Black Devotion cards like Gray Merchants, or you have powerful black payoffs like the Blight Breath Catoblepis or things along those lines, maybe you have an Erebos in your deck, then sure, Underworld Dreams is a card that you might be interested, whereas I would actually caution it against playing this in most of your other black decks. That moves us to red. Red is actually pretty quick. Red has only 2 Devotion cards, the God and the Demigod, so let's talk about them. I don't think we mentioned Purphoros yet at all. Purphoros is, Purphoros the Bronze-Blooded, is 4 and a red for a 7/6. Hey, I was right, it is a 7/6. Mythic Rare, Legendary God, Indestructible, Devotion needs to be 5 or greater, blah, blah, blah. The static ability, other creatures you control have haste. Well, this is a 5 mana creature, rather a 5 mana enchantment, and I believe this is the most expensive of all the gods. Maybe Nylea is more expensive, we'll see in a second, but 5 mana is a lot for an effect that just gives your other creatures haste, because your creatures are already going to be on board at that point. Sure, maybe Purphoros comes down and you follow up with a 6-drop and you get to start bashing. It's not an irrelevant ability, it's just kind of something you don't really care about tacked on to a 5 mana play already. Clearly, that haste part is there for the second ability, though, which is very variable. It's going to depend on what's going on in the game and what you have in your deck, whether or not this ability matters at all. But For 2 and a red, it says you may put a red creature or an artifact creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. I'm actually not in love with this because by the time you've cast Perforos, you've resolved it, it comes back to your next turn. You know, you untapped with at least 5 mana. You probably have 6 mana at that point. You can just cast your cards. You don't have to sneak attack them in, right? And this can only put red creatures and artifact creatures into play. I'm not even sure there are any artifact creatures in this set, and if there are, they're not very good. This can't sneak in like a big green creature and just, you know, put up 2 creatures on board and smash your opponent for a billion. It just can't do that. It can only put in red creatures, and there aren't a ton of red creatures that are really even worth sneaking into play like this, especially since you could just cast them and they have haste anyway, and then they don't sacrifice. So I don't know, Perforos seems more like a constructed level card or a commander card than it does a limited all-star. It does have the highest power and toughness, which seems like a nod to its ability not being great and limited, but the fact that red also doesn't have a lot of payoff for being devotion, like there isn't a push to be a red devotion deck, leads me to believe that Perforos is actually not that good of a card when it comes to limited. Maybe on par with like some of the better commons or something like that, but Perforos does not seem like a reason to try and build a mono red deck, so watch out there. Annex, I'm going to go ahead and skip over most of Annex's text because we've already talked about Annex at least 2 or 3 times in the course of this video. Maybe I have Annex pegged as the #1 best uncommon in the set because it's often going to be a 3-mana 4/3 or 5/3 that dies into multiple tokens and turns all your other creatures into tokens when they die. And at its base level, it's a 3-mana 2/3 that dies into a token. And that's pretty solid with such a high ceiling attached to it and an already pretty high floor. I think Annex is fantastic. Again, there's not really like a huge push to draft a red devotion deck. Annex is more of a payoff than Perforos in my opinion, but I don't know, Annex is just going to be great, and you shouldn't expect to see this card past like the first couple picks. This is the type of card that you pick up early, and you can move to basically any red archetype, and Annex will do work. Alright, enough about red, because there's not really a mono red deck to be had in this format. Let's go ahead and talk about green, which has a couple cards here. Starting with Nylea, our green god. No, it's a 5/6. Perforos is definitely the biggest of the gods. Nylea is 3 and a green. Nylea the Keen-Eyed is 3 and a green for a 5/6. Indestructible. Devotion needs to be 5 or greater. Blah, 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 blah. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Okay, that's a nice little bonus, but again, this is a 4-mana card itself, so by the time you get to your 5th turn, that means that you're probably already on par to be casting most of your creatures. It does do some cool things where you can double spell, right? You can cast maybe 2 3-drops in the same turn for only 4 mana or something like that, or cast a 4-drop and a 3-drop for just 5 mana, and that's strong, right? I'm not saying to neglect this ability or ignore this ability. It just means that, sometimes that ability won't be relevant as the game goes on. The real card advantage here is 2 and a green. Reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, put it into your hand. Otherwise, you may put it into your graveyard. And I like the may attached there because that means that this helps support the self-mill deck, especially green-black that we've already talked about. But you also don't have to put that card in your graveyard if you would rather draw it. Plus, if it's a creature, you get to just put it in your hand right away. And 3 mana is pretty reasonable. This is a huge mana sink later on in the game. For you to just fill up your graveyard or, just draw extra cards, right? If a board stall, Nylea is going to draw you enough cards or put enough cards in your graveyard that you're probably just going to win unless your opponent does something about it right away. And Nylea is pretty cool too because drawing extra creatures means adding more devotion to the board, which means Nylea is more likely to be a creature more often, just on account of the fact that you can put more cards in your hand, which means putting more cards on board. I don't think I need to explain how card advantage works here, but Nylea seems pretty sweet to me. Again, I don't think this is a bomb compared to some of the other mythics, right? I think the Titans are better than basically all of the gods, but Nylea does seem like one of the better ones. If I had to rank them, I would probably say Erebos is the best at face value, and then Nylea and Heliod are like tier 2, and then Thassa and Perforos are tier 3. Maybe Thassa deserves to be in tier 2 because the tap ability is decent, but Nylea seems solid here, and I would look for more green pips to try and get Nylea on board because a 5/6 indestructible, not negligible card. Renata, Called to the Hunt, is our green demigod. I don't believe we've mentioned this one in any video yet either, but it's pretty good. 2 green for an X3. The power is equal to your devotion to green, and that means you're on par with Caliphie or Anax as far as just being a huge creature that sometimes gets bigger, right? This one has a lower ceiling because it's 4 mana, whereas the other ones are 3. So this is a 4 mana 2/3, but green does have a lot of devotion going on, so Renata can get quite a bit bigger. Her static ability says each other creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. So it's the Grumgully ability we just saw from Eldraine, and it affects all creatures, not just the stupid non-humans or whatever. This seems really strong to me. It's a nice turn 4 play that enables your turn 5, turn 6 plays to come down as slightly bigger creatures. Your opponent's going to want to kill this if they can. It is kind of like a lightning rod for removal, since if they don't deal with this, it's going to make it harder to deal with additional creatures later on. And it affects tokens as well, if that ends up mattering. Green doesn't necessarily have a bunch of token making, but green-white does. Maybe green-red does, so on and so forth. So Renata seems like just a solid card. Again, like any of the demigods, I'm not taking one of these cards and then trying to be a monocolored deck, but I do think it'll be strong if you push in a green direction and try to maximize on its power. Colossus's Design is 5 and a green for an uncommon sorcery that says creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is your devotion to green. So this seems pretty powerful to me. It is kind of your 6 mana finisher for a green deck, but it does require A, that you have a bunch of creatures on board, and B, that you have a bunch of green devotion on board. So it's actually asking a lot, and you will note, unlike most overrun effects, this doesn't give trample. The difference between most overrun effects is that this could potentially give like +6/+6 instead of the typical +3/+3 or whatever most overruns give. So Colossus's Design has the potential to end the game, but asks that you have a pretty hefty board state and one that's able to attack. But this is the type of card that can steal a game out of nowhere, like an Overcome or something like that. You just have to make sure you position yourself to have as much green devotion as possible, and also try and spread your board as wide as possible, which is asking a lot, which is I don't think this is just a slam dunk devotion card, but it is one that will end a decent number of games. Seteshan Petitioner is 1 green for a 2/2 uncommon human druid, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain life equal to your devotion to green. So 3 mana, 2/2 that gains you 2 life, and if you have other additional green blips on board, gains you more life than that. This is a kind of dumbed down version of Neshin Nylia's Disciple, I believe, from Theros, which was a common. It was a 4 mana 3/3 with the same ability. This is 1 less mana, but also 1 less point of power and toughness, and that seems completely fair to me. It's also uncommon too, which I find a little bit interesting. I guess they playtested this and it just had the potential to gain so much life, it pushed aggro decks out of the format. But it's a nice little tool to have in a green deck. More of a sideboard card, I think, than a main board card, because there are some control decks in this format that won't really care about your life total, but against a deck that really needs to attack your life total, a beatdown deck or an aggro deck, I think Seteshan Petitioner is going to put in work. Nylia's Huntmaster, which I could have sworn was a name that was already used. Nylia's Huntmaster is 3 and a green for a 4/3 common Centaur Shaman. So 4 mana 4/3 is pretty decent. Again, there are a lot of 3/4s and 5/4s and stuff floating around, so 4 power seems very relevant here. But it enters the battlefield, and target creature you control gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is your devotion to green. Now, Nylia's Huntmaster itself only has 1 green blip, so at the very minimum, you give something else +1/+0, and the ceiling is to give something like +4 or +5/+0, and that's pretty good. It doesn't give trample or anything like that. It just makes a creature a better attacker for the turn, and if you can couple this with a flyer or a trample creature that you already have, seems pretty strong to me, and it's on top of a body that you're already probably interested in playing. So Nylia's Huntmaster gets a thumbs up from me, and does ask that you draft a little bit more green in your deck, even though it doesn't require it to be a good card. And a couple more cards to talk about here that aren't color specific. First off, there's Altar of the Pantheon. This is a 3 mana common artifact that says, as a static ability, your devotion to each color and each combination of colors is increased by 1. So this basically, just by virtue of being on board, adds 1 devotion to blue, 1 devotion to white, green, red, black, and 1 devotion to both like red and green. So if you happen to have a Colossus this will add 1 devotion to Kothis' count. And then it also adds 1 mana of any color by tapping it. If you control a god, demigod, or legendary enchantment, you gain a life. I mean, that's kind of a whatever bonus, right? If you gain life, whatever. You're using this card for mana fixing, and if you happen to be really heavy on devotion cards, this could be a card that you want. Now, I think you want to be in a multicolor deck before you actually draft Altar of the Pantheon, or if somehow you do end up in the route of being a monocolor deck, this is something that you're a little bit more interested in. But it's kind of just a filler manolith type card that has a little bit of extra nuance in a set that cares about devotion. And then we've got, as our final card here for this series, a commander card that you probably should not be playing in Limited, but here you go. Nyx Lotus is 4 mana for a legendary rare artifact. It enters the battlefield tapped, and when you tap it, you choose a color and add mana to your mana pool equal to your devotion to that color. So you choose red and you add red to your mana pool equal to your devotion to red. So it's kind of like a Nykthos attached to an artifact, and you can't use it the turn it comes into play because it comes in tapped. I don't think this card is particularly good. There's not a lot that really benefits from ramping in this set, right? There's not a lot of expensive cards in this set. There's like maybe 6 drops. I don't know. Did we even talk about a 7 drop in any of these videos? I'm not sure, really. There's not a lot of incentive to just have a bunch of extra mana in this format. You can use it, I'm sure, if you're able to draw a bunch of extra cards, or maybe you have something like Thassa in your deck. You can use this to just add a bunch of blue mana and tap your opponent's board down, but you really do need a mana sink. It's not just a generically good card to include in any deck, and even in, let's say you're a mono black deck, I don't see this really being better than just another permanent that adds black to your devotion rather than add a bunch of actual black mana. Like, in most cases, I think I'd rather have Altar of the Pantheon than Nyx Lotus. Sweet card. I'm not knocking it for design. I think it's going to be awesome in Commander, but I don't really see the utility of it in Limited. And with that being said, that ends our series for Theros Beyond Death. Thank you for hanging out. I hope this series has been useful in some way, shape, or form to somebody out there. Maybe helping you prep for a pre-release or your first draft or sealed event or something along those lines. Again, you can let me know in the comments whether anything I've said in any of these 6 videos has helped you in any way, shape, or form, and you can show that gratitude by dropping a like, subscribing, leaving a comment, whatever you feel you're comfortable with. I'm awesome with. So thanks for watching. Again, I appreciate you hanging out with me. I hope that your pre-releases go very well. I hope you open your Titans or your Elspeths or your Ashiok's, whatever card you're looking for. I hope you open it in that pre-release kit and get a nice shiny stamped foil. So keep up with me. Let me know how those events go. I will be drafting Theros Beyond Death for the channel as soon as it drops on Arena. Hopefully by next week we'll have a couple videos up. It might be sealed because they usually do sealed before they do draft, but I'm looking forward to it. I'm extremely excited to be back to Theros, the set that I started with, and I think this set looks like it's going to be awesome for Limited. So one last time, thanks for watching. My name's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and I will see you all next time.